The world changes faster because of Venezuela. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not the date of a major war, not a terrorist attack, not even a financial crash. Just another Sunday in Caracas, where Nicolas Maduro stood before a crowd of supporters and declared victory in Venezuela's presidential election. The official results gave him 51% of the vote, a narrow but decisive win over opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez. The U.S. State Department called the election deeply flawed. The European Union questioned its legitimacy. The mainstream media ran with the another rigged election in a failed state, another predictable chapter in Venezuela's slow-motion collapse. But here's the thing, this wasn't just another election. It was a geopolitical earthquake, one that most people still don't fully grasp. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of energy, great power competition, and the unraveling of American hegemony. And what I can tell you is Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's the fulcrum on which the 21st century's balance of power is tilting. The world is changing faster than most realize, and Caracas is the epicenter of that shift. Now, let me be clear, I'm not saying Maduro is a Democrat. Far from it. But the way the US and its allies have responded to this election tells us far more about their own strategic desperation than it does about Venezuela's internal dynamics. And if we don't understand what's really happening here, we won't understand the next decade of global conflict. So let's start with the official story, the one you've been hearing in the news. The official what they want you to believe. The line from Washington, Brussels, and most Western capitals is Venezuela's election was a sham. The National Electoral Council, controlled by Maduro's regime, announced results that no independent observers could verify. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, claims Gonzalez actually won in a landslide. Some estimates suggest 60 to 70% of the vote. The US has refused to recognize the results, the EU has called for transparency, and even some Latin American governments, traditionally cautious about criticizing Venezuela, have joined the chorus of condemnation. The data seems to support this view. Venezuela's economy has collapsed. GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013, inflation has hit 1 million% at its peak, and over 7 million people have fled the country. The regime has jailed opponents, suppressed protests, and turned what was once Latin America's wealthiest nation into a pariah state. The election, in this telling, was just the latest act of desperation by a dictatorship clinging to power. And then there's the oil. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia. For decades, that oil flowed to the US, making Venezuela a key supplier. But after Maduro's crackdowns, the US imposed sanctions in 2019, cutting off Venezuela's access to global markets. The result? A further economic implosion, but also a shift in global energy flows. China and Russia stepped in, buying Venezuelan oil at a discount, providing loans, and keeping the regime afloat. So the official narrative goes like Maduro is a dictator who stole an election, his regime is a threat to regional stability, and the US has a moral and strategic obligation to support democracy in Venezuela. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and even the threat of military action are justified to bring about regime change. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong that Maduro is a dictator, the election was flawed, and Venezuela is a humanitarian disaster. The problem is that this story is incomplete. It ignores the geopolitical forces at play, the hidden agendas of the great powers, and the fact that Venezuela's crisis is not just about Venezuela. It's about the death of the American-led world order and the birth of something far more unstable. What's really happening in Venezuela? Let's start with the election itself. The opposition claims Gonzalez won 60 to 70% of the vote. That's plausible. Maduro's approval ratings have been in the low 20s for years. But here's the opposition's own polling showed a much closer race in the final weeks. Why? Because Maduro's regime has perfected the art of electoral manipulation not just through outright fraud, but through a combination of coercion, patronage, and divide-and-rule tactics. The data doesn't support the idea of a massive, undeniable opposition landslide. What it does support is a deeply flawed process where neither side can claim full legitimacy. And that's exactly what Maduro wants. A narrow, contested victory is better for him than a clear loss because it allows him to claim a mandate while keeping the opposition divided. Now, let's talk about the sanctions. The US has imposed some of the harshest economic restrictions in modern history on Venezuela. The goal? To cripple Maduro's regime and force him out. But here's the sanctions don't work the way policymakers think they do. They don't topple dictators, they entrench them. Look at Cuba, Iran, North Korea. Sanctions create a siege mentality, rallying the population around the regime while the elites find ways to profit from the black market. In Venezuela, the sanctions have had two unintended consequences. First, they've pushed Maduro into the arms of China and Russia. Second, they've accelerated Venezuela's shift away from the US dollar. In 2023, Venezuela became the first OPEC nation to sell oil in yuan. That might seem like a minor detail, but it's not. It's a direct challenge to the petrodollar system, the foundation of American financial hegemony. And here's where it gets interesting. The US has been quietly negotiating with Maduro for over a year. In 2023, the Biden administration eased some sanctions in exchange for promises of free and fair elections. But those negotiations were always fragile. Why? Because the US isn't just dealing with Maduro, it's dealing with a regime that has Russia and China as its backers. Let me tell you something I've learned from decades of studying great power: when a country becomes a proxy battleground, the local actors stop being the main players. Venezuela isn't just a dictatorship, it's a pawn in a much larger game. The X did geopolitical Venezuela as the new Berlin. To understand what's really happening in Venezuela, you have to out. This isn't just about a failed state in Latin America. It's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order and the return of great power competition. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, that it could shape the world in its image, using a combination of military force, economic sanctions, and soft power. That era is over. We're now in a multipolar world, where the US, China, and Russia are locked in a three-way struggle for influence. And Venezuela is one of the key battlegrounds. Let's break it. Russia's Moscow sees Venezuela as a way to bleed the US in its own backyard. Since 2006, Russia has sold Venezuela over $11 billion in arms, including fighter jets, tanks, and missile systems. In 2019, Russia sent troops to Venezuela to prop up Maduro during a coup attempt. And in 2023, Putin announced a $1.5 billion investment in Venezuela's oil sector. Why? Because every dollar Russia spends in Venezuela is a dollar the US has to spend countering it. It's classic Cold War: force your adversary to overextend itself. China's Beijing's approach is more subtle but no less strategic. China has lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, most of it secured by oil. When Venezuela defaulted, China didn't push for repayment; instead, it renegotiated the terms, ensuring that Venezuela's oil would keep flowing to Chinese refineries. And in 2023, China and Venezuela signed a 25-year cooperation agreement, covering everything from infrastructure to military ties. The message? China is in Venezuela for the long haul. The US. Washington's strategy is a mess. On one hand, the US wants to isolate Maduro. On the other, it needs Venezuelan oil. The Biden administration has flip-flopped between sanctions and negotiations, never fully committing to either. And that's the problem. America's Venezuela policy is driven more by domestic politics than by grand strategy. Now, let me be: this isn't just about oil. It's about spheres of influence. The US has long treated Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the Cold War interventions, the drug wars, all of it was based on the idea that no outside power could challenge American dominance in the region. But Russia and China are doing exactly that. And they're doing it in a way that the US can't easily counter. Here's the historical: Venezuela today is what Berlin was in the 1960s, a flashpoint where the great powers test each other's resolve. The difference? In the Cold War, the US and USSR had clear red lines. Today, those lines are blurred. And that makes the situation far more dangerous. military and strategic. The next crisis could start in Caracas. Let's talk about the military dimension. The U.S. has a long history of intervention in Latin America: Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, MA in 1989, and more recently, the failed coup in Venezuela in 2019. So when people talk about regime change in Venezuela, they're not just speculating. It's a real possibility. But here's the: military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. Let me explain why. First, Venezuela's military is not Iraq's military in 2003. It's a battle-hardened force that has been fighting insurgencies and drug cartels for years. The regime has also cultivated deep ties with Russia and China, meaning any U.S. intervention would risk direct confrontation with those powers. Second, Venezuela's geography makes it a nightmare for invaders. The country is covered in dense jungles, mountains, and urban sprawl. The U.S. learned in Vietnam and Afghanistan that terrain matters, and Venezuela's terrain is unforgiving. Third, the regime has prepared for this. Maduro has spent years building a network of paramilitary groups, known as colectivos, that operate outside the formal military chain of command. These groups are armed, fanatically loyal, and would wage a brutal insurgency against any occupying force. And fourth, there's the oil. Venezuela's oil infrastructure is old, decrepit, and vulnerable. Any conflict would likely lead to massive environmental damage and a global energy shock. Remember the 1991 Gulf War, when Iraq set Kuwait's oil fields on fire? Imagine that, but worse. Now, I'm not saying the US won't intervene. I'm saying that if it does, it will be a quagmire. And the hawks in Washington who think this will be a quick and easy operation are either delusional or lying. But here's the real: the US doesn't even need to invade to lose. Every day that Venezuela remains under Maduro's control is a day that Russia and China extend their influence in the Western Hemisphere. And that's a strategic defeat for the US, regardless of whether a single American soldier sets foot in Caracas. The domestic political why Venezuela matters in Washington. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about U.S. domestic politics. Because Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy issue, it's a political football. For the last decade, Venezuela has been a rallying cry for both the left and the right in the U.S. The left sees Maduro as a victim of American imperialism. The right sees him as a socialist dictator who must be overthrown. And both sides use Venezuela to score points in the culture wars. But here's what most people don't: Venezuela policy is driven more by electoral politics than by national security. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president. It was a bold move, but it was also a political calculation. Florida is a swing state, and Venezuelan Americans are a growing voting bloc. By taking a hard line on Maduro, Trump was sending a message to that "I'm on your side." The Biden administration has been more cautious, but it's still under pressure. In 2024, with the election looming, Biden can't afford to look soft on Maduro. That's why we've seen a return to sanctions and tough rhetoric. It's not about strategy, it's about votes. And here's the more the US focuses on Venezuela as a political issue, the less it focuses on the real strategic challenge: China and Russia's growing influence in Latin America. That's the danger of letting domestic politics drive foreign policy. It distorts priorities and leads to bad decisions. Scenario: what happens next in Venezuela? So where does this go from here? Let's look at 3 possible scenarios, each with its own set of risks. Scenario 1, the status quo. In this scenario, Maduro survives the current crisis, but Venezuela remains isolated. The US keeps sanctions in place, but China and Russia continue to prop up the regime. Venezuela's economy stagnates, but the country avoids collapse. The opposition remains divided, and Maduro rules through a combination of repression and patronage. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. It's also the most dangerous for the US, because it allows Russia and China to deepen their foothold in the region. Scenario 2, regime collapse. In this scenario, the opposition manages to unite and force Maduro out either through mass protests, a military coup, or a negotiated transition. The US and its allies recognize a new government, sanctions are lifted, and Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding. This is the best-case scenario for the US, but it's far from guaranteed. Even if Maduro falls, Venezuela's problems won't disappear overnight. The country is deeply divided, its institutions are weak, and its economy is in ruins. And there's no guarantee that a new government would be pro-American. In fact, it might be even more hostile. Scenario 3: Escalation. In this scenario, the US and its allies take more aggressive action either through a naval blockade, a cyber attack, or even a limited military intervention. Russia and China respond by increasing their support for Maduro, leading to a proxy conflict. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. If the US feels its influence in Latin America slipping, it might lash out. And if Russia and China feel threatened, they might escalate. The result could be a new Cold War in the Western Hemisphere. None of these scenarios are good. But the most likely one, the status quo, is also the most strategically damaging for the US. Because every day that Venezuela remains under Maduro's control is a day that America's enemies gain ground. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Venezuela is just one piece of a much larger puzzle, the unraveling of the American-led world order. For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America could and should shape the world in its image, using a combination of military power, economic dominance, and ideological influence. That strategy has failed. Look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan ended in disaster. The color revolutions in the former Soviet Union have mostly failed. The Arab Spring led to chaos, not democracy. China has risen as a peer competitor, and Russia has re-emerged as a revisionist power. And yet, the US keeps doubling down on the same failed strategies. Sanctions, regime change, military interventions, none of it works, but Washington keeps trying. Why? Because the foreign policy establishment is trapped in a mindset of dominance. It can't accept that the world is moving toward multipolarity. It can't accept that other powers have their own interests and their own spheres of influence. Venezuela is a perfect example. The US sees Maduro as a dictator who must be overthrown. Russia and China see him as a partner who must be protected. And the result is a stalemate, one that benefits America's adversaries. This is the central flaw in American grand: the belief that the US can and should control every corner of the globe. It can't. And the sooner Washington accepts that, the better. What the US should do instead. So what should the US do about Venezuela? Let me tell you what I've been arguing for. The US needs to abandon its failed strategy of regime change and adopt a policy of great power management. Here's what that would look. 1. Containment, not confrontation. Instead of trying to overthrow Maduro, the US should focus on containing his influence. That means working with regional allies to isolate Venezuela diplomatically and economically, while avoiding direct confrontation. 2. Energy diplomacy. The US should use its energy leverage to counter Russia and China. That means lifting some sanctions on Venezuelan oil, not to help Maduro, but to reduce global dependence on Russian and Iranian oil. It's a pragmatic move, not an ideological one. 3. Regional alliances. The US should strengthen its alliances in Latin America not through coercion, but through cooperation. That means investing in infrastructure, trade, and security partnerships. It means treating Latin America as a partner, not a backyard. 4. No military intervention. This should go without saying, but I'll say it: the US should not invade Venezuela. The risks far outweigh the rewards. If the US wants to counter Russia and China, it should do so through diplomacy and economic competition, not through war. 5. Long-term strategy. The US needs to accept that Venezuela is a lost cause in the short term. But that doesn't mean it's lost forever. The key is to position the US as the partner of choice for the next generation of Latin American leaders. That means investing in education, technology, and democratic institutions, not just in Venezuela, but across the region. The US should be playing the long game, not chasing short-term wins that backfire spectacularly. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a political or economic crisis, it's a military one, too. And the way the US has handled it reveals a deeper problem in how Washington thinks about power. Let me explain why this matters. For years, the Pentagon has treated Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where the real competition happens elsewhere, in Europe, the Middle East, or the Indo-Pacific. But that's a mistake. Venezuela has become a testing ground for how Russia and China project power in America's backyard, and the US is losing the narrative. Take the Russian presence, for example. In 2019, Moscow sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela, a move that was as much about messaging as it was about military capability. The bombers didn't stay long, but the point was Russia can operate in the Western Hemisphere, and there's little the US can do about it without escalating into a direct confrontation. Then there's China. Beijing has been quietly extending its military footprint in the region, not through bases, but through arms sales, training, and intelligence cooperation. Venezuela is a key node in this strategy. In 2020, Maduro announced that China had helped Venezuela develop a new satellite surveillance system, ostensibly for civilian use but with clear military applications. And let's not forget the Russian Wagner Group, which has been active in Venezuela, providing security for Maduro and training local forces. This isn't just about mercenaries, it's about deniable influence, the kind that lets Moscow meddle without leaving fingerprints. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent military strategy for Latin America because it doesn't see the region as a priority. That's a mistake. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy barely mentions Latin America, focusing instead on China and Russia's activities in Europe and Asia. But if you want to understand how great power competition is playing out in the 21st century, look at Venezuela. It's where the rules of the game are being rewritten. Take the issue of sanctions. The US has imposed some of the harshest economic restrictions in history on Venezuela, but they haven't worked. Why? Because sanctions don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a broader geopolitical chessboard, and Russia and China have been more than happy to help Maduro circumvent them. In 2020, the US seized a shipment of Iranian gasoline bound for Venezuela, but that was just one battle in a much larger war. Iran and Venezuela have been deepening their military ties, with Tehran providing drones and technical expertise. Meanwhile, China has become Venezuela's largest creditor, propping up the regime with loans and investments that have allowed it to survive despite US pressure. The US response? More sanctions. More rhetoric about democracy. More of the same failed approach. What Washington doesn't seem to grasp is that military power isn't just about bombs and bases, it's about influence, and influence is won through economic and diplomatic leverage. The US has plenty of both, but it's squandering them on a strategy that hasn't worked in 2 decades. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the Trump administration backed Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate leader, a move that was supposed to trigger a mass uprising against Maduro. It didn't. Instead, it exposed the limits of US influence. Guaido's support collapsed, and Maduro consolidated power with help from Russia and China. The lesson? You can't impose democracy at gunpoint, and you can't will a political transition into existence. The US needs to accept that military intervention isn't an option, it's a fantasy. But that doesn't mean the US should do nothing. Far from it. The military implications of Venezuela's crisis are real, and they're spreading. Take Colombia, for example. Bogotá has been a key US ally in the region, but its government is under pressure from leftist groups with ties to Venezuela. The FARC dissidents, who rejected the 2016 peace deal, have found sanctuary in Venezuela, using it as a base to launch attacks into Colombia. This isn't just a border dispute, it's a proxy war, with Venezuela playing the role of spoiler. And the US? It's on the sidelines, watching as its influence erodes. Then there's the drug trade. Venezuela has become a major transit point for cocaine bound for the US and Europe, with the Maduro regime allegedly profiting from it. The DEA has accused high-ranking Venezuelan officials of drug trafficking, but the US has been unable to do much about it. Why? Because the cartels have diversified their routes, using the chaos in Venezuela to evade interdiction. And with Russia and China providing cover, Maduro has little incentive to crack down. So what should the US do? First, it needs to recognize that military power isn't just about kinetic action, it's about shaping the environment. That means working with allies to counter Russian and Chinese influence, not just in Venezuela, but across the region. It means investing in intelligence sharing, cybersecurity, and counter-narcotics operations. And it means accepting that the US can't do it alone. Second, the US needs to rethink its approach to sanctions. Right now, they're a blunt instrument, hurting ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. Instead of blanket restrictions, the US should target specific individuals and entities, while offering incentives for cooperation. For example, the US could lift some sanctions in exchange for Venezuela cracking down on drug trafficking or allowing humanitarian aid to flow freely. It's not about rewarding Maduro, it's about creating leverage. Third, the US needs to strengthen its alliances in the region. That means working with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to counter Russian and Chinese influence, not just through military aid, but through economic and diplomatic cooperation. The US should be offering alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative, not just complaining about it. And it should be treating Latin America as a partner, not a client. Finally, the US needs to accept that Venezuela is a problem that won't be solved overnight. The regime isn't going anywhere, and the US needs to prepare for a long-term competition. That means investing in the next generation of Latin American leaders, supporting civil society, and promoting economic development. It means playing the long game, not chasing quick fixes. The world is changing faster because of Venezuela, and the US is struggling to keep up. But if Washington wants to remain a global leader, it needs to adapt. That means accepting the limits of its power, rethinking its strategies, and embracing a new approach to great power competition. The alternative? A world where Russia and China write the rules, and the US is left playing catch-up. And that's a future none of us should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battle for Venezuela isn't being fought in the halls of the UN or the backrooms of the State Department, it's being fought in the streets of Caracas, the oil fields of the Orinoco Belt, and the slums of Petar. The domestic political dimensions of this crisis are far more volatile than the geopolitical chessboard, and they're the key to understanding why Maduro's regime has survived this long and why it might collapse faster than anyone expects. Let me explain why this matters. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that Maduro is a dictator clinging to power through brute force, and that's not wrong. But it's incomplete. The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela's political system is far more resilient and far more fractured than most analysts give it credit for. The regime isn't just a monolith, it's a coalition of military officers, corrupt bureaucrats, and loyalist politicians who have learned to adapt to sanctions, hyperinflation, and international isolation. They've done this by creating what I call a dual economy, one for the elite, who profit from black market oil sales and gold smuggling, and one for everyone else, who scrape by on remittances and government handouts. Here's the data that backs this up. According to Transparency International, Venezuela ranks 177th out of 180 countries in its Corruption Perceptions Index, worse than North Korea. But corruption isn't just a moral failing, it's the glue that holds the regime together. The military, for example, controls everything from food distribution to the country's ports, and senior officers have been accused of running drug trafficking operations. In 2020, the U.S. indicted former Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez on drug trafficking charges, but he's still in power. Why? Because he's too valuable to the regime's survival. The same goes for Diosdado Cabello, the powerful National Assembly president and Maduro's right-hand man, who has been sanctioned by the U.S. but remains untouchable in Caracas. But here's the regime's resilience is also its greatest weakness. The more it tightens its grip, the more it alienates its own base. Take the 2020 parliamentary elections, which were boycotted by the opposition and condemned by the international community. The regime claimed a landslide victory, but turnout was abysmal, just 31%, according to independent estimates. That's not a mandate, it's a sign of a system that's running on fumes. The same goes for the economy. Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013, but the regime has managed to keep the lights on in Caracas by selling gold to Turkey, oil to China, and even cryptocurrency to evade sanctions. It's a house of cards, but it's a house of cards that's still standing. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because this is where the story gets even messier. The narrative in the West is that Juan Guaidó, the self-proclaimed interim president, was the great hope for democracy. But Guaidó's moment has passed, and the opposition is more divided than ever. In 2021, the regime banned Guaidó and his allies from running in elections, and the opposition fractured into three main: the hardliners who still support Guaidó, the pragmatists who want to negotiate with the regime, and the radicals who believe in armed resistance. This infighting has made it nearly impossible for the opposition to present a united front, and it's given Maduro the space to consolidate power. But here's the opposition's weakness is also an opportunity. The regime's survival depends on its ability to keep the opposition divided, and if the US and its allies want to change the game, they need to stop treating Venezuela like a binary choice between Maduro and Guaidó. Instead, they should be working with the pragmatists, people like Enrique Capriles, who has called for a negotiated solution, or Maria Corina Machado, who represents the more radical wing of the opposition. The goal shouldn't be regime change, it should be creating enough pressure to force the regime to the negotiating table. And that brings me to the most underreported story in Venezuela: the role of the military. The armed forces are the backbone of the regime, but they're also its Achilles heel. The military has been hit hard by sanctions, and there are signs of growing discontent among mid-ranking officers. In 2019, a group of soldiers led by Captain Javier Nieto Quintero launched a failed uprising against Maduro. The regime crushed it, but the fact that it happened at all is a sign of the cracks in the system. The question is whether the US and its allies can exploit those cracks without triggering a violent backlash. Here's my scenario projection for the next 18 months. The most likely outcome is a continuation of the status: Maduro remains in power, the economy limps along, and the opposition remains divided. But there are two wildcards that could change everything. The first is the 2024 presidential election. The regime has already signaled that it will allow some opposition candidates to run, but only if they agree to play by its rules. If the opposition can unite behind a single candidate, and if the international community can pressure the regime to allow a free and fair election, then we could see a surprise upset. The second wildcard is the military. If the regime's economic mismanagement leads to a collapse in living standards, we could see a repeat of the 2019 uprising, but this time with more support from mid-ranking officers. That's a long shot, but it's not impossible. The bottom line is Venezuela is a country on the edge, and the next few years will determine whether it becomes a failed state or a regional flashpoint. The US and its allies need to stop treating it as a geopolitical pawn and start treating it as a domestic political crisis. That means working with the opposition, pressuring the regime, and preparing for the possibility of sudden change. Because one thing is, the world is changing faster because of Venezuela, and the longer we ignore the domestic dimensions of this crisis, the harder it will be to shape the outcome. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a laboratory for the future of geopolitical competition. The way this plays out will set precedents for how great powers engage with fragile states, how authoritarian regimes adapt to sanctions, and how migration flows reshape regional stability. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. First, there's the question of grand strategy. The US has oscillated between two courses of diplomacy and benign neglect. Neither has worked. The sanctions regime, which the Treasury Department has layered on since 2017, has crippled the economy but failed to dislodge Maduro. In fact, it's had the perverse effect of consolidating his control by forcing the regime to rely on illicit networks, gold smuggling to Turkey, oil for food deals with Iran, and cryptocurrency schemes to bypass the dollar system. The US has treated Venezuela as a problem to be contained, not a crisis to be resolved. That's a mistake. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration's policy has been a study in contradictions. On one hand, it's maintained the Trump-era sanctions, even as it quietly allowed Chevron to resume limited operations in 2022, a tacit admission that the economic strangulation wasn't working. On the other, it's engaged in sporadic negotiations with Maduro, like the 2023 Barbados Agreement, which secured the release of a handful of political prisoners in exchange for sanctions relief. But these talks have been transactional, not transformational. The US hasn't articulated a coherent vision for what comes after Maduro, because it's still operating under the assumption that regime change is the only acceptable outcome. That's a failure of imagination. The alternatives are stark. The first is a managed transition, something akin to the 1989 Chilean model, where Pinochet was pressured into holding a referendum that led to his ouster. In Venezuela's case, that would require the US and the EU to offer Maduro a credible off-sanctions relief, legal protections, and a guarantee that he won't face prosecution in exchange for free elections and a phased withdrawal of Cuban and Russian security advisors. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's the only way to avoid a protracted collapse. The second alternative is a slow-motion implosion, where the regime clings to power until the economy hits rock bottom, triggering a mass exodus that destabilizes Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The third is a military coup, which could go either way. Either a nationalist faction takes over and tries to reboot the economy, or the country fractures into warlordism, with regional commanders carving out fiefdoms. Let me put this in historical context. Venezuela's crisis is often compared to Cuba's, but the more apt analogy is Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Like Yugoslavia, Venezuela is a multi-ethnic, oil-rich state with a strong man at the helm, a collapsing economy, and external powers jockeying for influence. The difference is that Venezuela's implosion is happening in slow motion, giving the world time to react or to look away. The US and Europe have the tools to shape the outcome, but they lack the political will. The EU, for instance, has been more proactive than the US in engaging with the opposition, but its leverage is limited. The real wildcard is China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Venezuela, not through loans, but through trade and technology. Huawei's deep ties to the Venezuelan government, for example, give China a backdoor into the country's surveillance state. If Maduro falls, China will be the first to recognize the new government if it's one they can work with. Now, let's talk about the regional implications. Venezuela's collapse has already redrawn the map of Latin America. Colombia, which has absorbed nearly 3 million Venezuelan migrants, is struggling to maintain social cohesion. Brazil's far right has used the crisis to stoke xenophobia, while Peru and Ecuador have seen spikes in crime linked to Venezuelan gangs. The Caribbean, meanwhile, has become a battleground for influence. Cuba and Russia have doubled down on their support for Maduro, while the US has tried to counter them by offering energy assistance to Caribbean nations through the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative. But these efforts are piecemeal. What's missing is a regional strategy that treats Venezuela as a shared problem, not a US headache. Here's where the grand strategy comes in. The US needs to stop thinking of Venezuela as a Cold War relic and start treating it as a 21st century challenge. That means three things. First, it needs to work with the opposition to develop a post-Maduro transition plan, one that includes economic stabilization, security sector reform, and a truth and reconciliation process. Second, it needs to engage with China and Russia to find a face-saving exit for Maduro. And third, it needs to invest in regional resilience, not just containment. That means helping Colombia and Brazil manage migration flows, supporting Caribbean energy security, and countering Russian and Chinese influence in the hemisphere. The most likely outcome, unfortunately, is that none of this happens. The US will continue to muddle through, the opposition will remain divided, and Maduro will cling to power until the next crisis forces his hand. But that doesn't mean the world can afford to ignore Venezuela. The country is a stress test for the international system, a warning of what happens when great powers treat domestic crises as geopolitical chess pieces. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to put the pieces back together. Let me leave you with this thought. Venezuela is not just a country in crisis, it's a mirror. It reflects the failures of our global order, the inability to manage state collapse, the rise of authoritarian resilience, and the limits of coercive diplomacy. The world is changing faster because of Venezuela, but the question is whether we'll learn from it or be overwhelmed by it. The choice is ours.